Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this morning's event, which is in partnership with ODI and the International Broadcasting Trust. And the premise of this conversation, Migration is the Media Getting It Right, is something that all of us in this room, as journalists, policymakers, people who are in the NGO sector, strategists, government and policymakers constantly think about. So we have a lot of experts in this room. Of course, we have our excellent panel as well, but we do want this conversation to be as fluid and as engaging as possible. So please feel free to ask questions. You will have time towards the end of the session, but within the session as well, if you feel you need to raise a point or discuss something, or you want something raised, it would be great to get your engagement as well. I've got a few housekeeping things I need to get out of the way. This session is being recorded. It is in person, but you can get the recording afterwards as well. There is no fire alarm planned, so if it does ring, please exit the room immediately. Now, as I said, the issue of migration and displacement is perhaps close to all of our hearts. I mean, personally, for me, it is a massive issue. Not only have I covered it as a journalist, but I am the child of refugees to Australia. So this is something that I constantly think about, public attitude towards refugees and migrants. And of course, we know that this is something that is incredibly divisive during election times and election campaigns. We've seen what's happened in the United States in the last few months. And of course, it continues to be part of the public discourse here in Europe and in the United Kingdom. So we will be talking about all of these issues. Every now and then, we hear about a boat capsizing in the Mediterranean or off the coast of Yemen. And really, that is the only time that we hear about a group of migrants making an incredibly dangerous and treacherous journey to get to a safer place, to find a better life for themselves. But the truth is that we are now facing one of the largest movements of people in history. 10 years ago, when the so-called migrant crisis happened, governments, policymakers everywhere talked about the fact that we needed to deal with the issues and deal with the issues not just in host countries, but also at the root cause. So one of the questions that I want to pose today, 10 years on, have we actually done it? And have we actually dealt with all of these issues? I'd like to begin by introducing my brilliant and expert panel. Andrew Connolly, who's an investigative journalist and host of Fortress Europe podcast. Vivian Francis, director of One World Media and founder of the Refugee Journalism Project. Jessica Hagen-Zanker, Head of Migration and Displacement Hub, ODI Global. Nazik Ramadan, Director and founder of Migrant Voice. Diane Taylor, Guardian correspondent and writer on human rights, racism and civil liberties. And Emma Young, executive producer of Go Back to Where You Came From, which of course started in Australia and caused a massive public debate. And we will be talking about that today as well. Before we begin, I'd like to show us a short video.
ODI has a new migration and displacement hub. We do research, advisory work, and influencing for a fairer, more evidence-based discussion around migration. Some of my colleagues and I have taken a look at a few harmful misconceptions on migration that are often amplified in the media.
Judging by the news headlines about immigration, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the UK public feel negatively about the subject. But this is often more a reflection of political rhetoric than the actual views of the public. Our research shows that in many European countries, including the UK, people feel increasingly positive about immigration. Though trends fluctuate, of course, across a 20-year period, we have seen noticeable positive shifts in a range of areas. In fact, the UK public is amongst the most positive in Europe on this issue. While in 2002, only 30% of the public said immigration makes the UK a better place to live, this had more than doubled 20 years later. As migration continues to top news agendas, it's important to bear in mind that in public attitudes terms, we're a long way from the more negative feelings towards migrants that dominated public consciousness 20 years ago. And there's lots of evidence that the UK public is ready for a more nuanced discussion.
In media and political discourse, migrants are frequently framed as a burden for the UK. They depict migrants as welfare scroungers who just come to the country to do nothing particularly productive. The reality could not be more different. Political statements and initiatives that focus on the prevention of immigration make the headlines. They receive much more attention. But behind them, we see a different picture. There are policies that many countries adopt to actually attract foreign workers to fill labor shortages. And also there are trade deals that include provisions to facilitate the delivery of services, the import of services for firms and people through migrant workers. So our question is the public receiving accurate reporting on the UK's immigration policies? What is going under the radar? Can the media play a greater role in shedding light on the positive, vital impacts of immigration in the UK?
Migration, especially when sudden or large in scale, is often framed as a crisis. We've all seen headlines about overwhelming numbers of migrants being framed as a threat to security, resources, and social cohesion. And this is often the case when we're talking about climate displacement. Despite alarmist rhetoric on the threat of mass migration to Europe, evidence suggests that most movement will be internal, with people choosing to remain in their own countries or not being able to move at all. What media actors should be paying attention to is not how a worsening climate will lead to mass displacement across borders, but rather how climate migration will overlap with existing patterns of mobility. We found that people who are able to move, particularly across borders, tend to be among the most privileged, and that more attention should be paid to those who remain.
So today, we're here to ask, is the media getting it right? And what does the media need from those of us working on these topics?
Okay, so big talking points. I just want to begin with you, Jessica, because we heard there on the video that, there is evidence to show that attitudes aren't necessarily hardening the way that the media may be portraying. Can you just talk us through that evidence? I just want to scrutinize that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the evidence on public attitudes is in general really it's mixed. So it's getting more positive in general, but it's mixed, and of course depends on the specific poll that's been done or the specific question you looked at, how that's framed. So I think the reason why we may not be aware of the fact that attitudes are actually getting more positive in general is because statistics and data can be misused or can be focused on one specific year or specific framing of a question, and therefore show what the media wants to show.
Andrew, I wonder, you're a podcaster, you're a journalist. Would you agree with that premise? I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of research done here, in what is being presented. But even when I've traveled sort of across Europe and spoken to people, and you look at the rise of things like populist ideals and discussions in elections, rise of nationalism, it has appeared that attitudes are actually hardening towards refugees and migrants.
I mean, I think it's also, is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also, I mean, that's true. And the general media is generally failing on if the goal indeed is to actually prevent atrocities happening, which is basically really what I focus on, what I think actually dehumanization ultimately leads to. The stakes are that high, and they are happening right now, and there's more likelihood of more happening. So no, the media is not doing a good enough job, but it's also important to highlight when it does. So Diane's colleagues at The Guardian, for example, on the Windrush, that's an example of when the media really does change the narrative. And your colleagues, Yalda, just came back from, say, Goma, where Rwanda is invading the DRC. That until recently was a regime that the UK was bankrolling. But at the time, when the Rwanda plan was being discussed, did you hear about how that might actually influence stability on the continent of Africa and how that itself was contributing to mass displacements and death? No. So that's why I think migration is too often presented as just a domestic affair about what people may think about an asylum hotel and so on, and it fits people in this kind of binary way, but it's a global phenomenon. And actually, one last thing, we like if indeed it is so that there is rising hostility against migrants, which I think sometimes is cooked up, but is also real. Well, that's probably because we stopped focusing on who they are and why they may be going to the places that they're going. We seem to be focused too much in the UK now about the method in which migrants come to the UK. We don't even really, we call it small boats. We don't actually call them people. We focus on the components of the small boats and we focus on the smugglers. And the more and more distant you, the more abstract these people become. So they're not really people anymore. The more it excuses the worst kind of treatment to them. So if it is the case that there's rising hostility against migrants, that's probably one of the reasons why.
And that brings me to Nazek, because that's really what you try and tackle, try and create sort of the humanization of refugees and migrants by placing stories around them in the media.
And this is a huge challenge for us. But to answer maybe your earlier question, I mean, the story that the statistic that a lot of the public actually support migrants. How often do you hear those stories? How often are they reported? And how much space they're given on airtime, etc. A lot of the time, most of the media focus is on negative stories, is on even, I mean, it started from the top, it started from the politicians presenting migration as a problem, even though the legal migration is presented as, yes, those people, we need them. We physically, actively, actually proactively go abroad, recruit them to come and work for us because we need them. But we still see them as a problem. We still tell them there are too many of you, you're a problem. We have to deal with you, even though we need you, and you are treating our, treating us in hospitals, you are teaching our children, you are growing our food, you are doing, maintaining our, etc. industries. They are presented as a problem, and they focus the whole conversations about numbers are too many of them, even if they're good, even if we need them, it's still a problem. We need to reduce it. I mean, again, think about us migrants on the other, watching the news and listening to all this, how we view this, that's how we're seen as too many of us. We reduce the statistics to numbers. We are told we are a problem. I think this is our biggest challenge, and how much space we're given in media stories. I mean, I must admit that there has been improvement since my organization set up 15 years ago. At that time the journalists were asking, yeah, we don't mind to talk to journalists, but where are they? To now, 15 years later, actually, journalists do call us to say, I'm working on a story, what do you think? Do you have anyone? So there has been a lot of changes that we need to acknowledge and recognize. But at the same time, we are still absent in most of the stories about us. Most of the stories about migrants, they have so-called experts or other people talking about migrants. And if migration is presented as a problem in negative light, and there is direct link between what politicians say, what the media covered, and the riots last summer. They didn't come from a void. There is a reason, and this is something we've been worrying on for a long time. So unless people see us as people, unless we report it not, as the real people who we are, we're not going to change the narrative. We are still largely absent from stories about us.
And Nazek, I'm just going to ask you about those changes that you've seen in the last 15 years. What more can actually be done to humanize, to have fewer people talking about migrants and refugees and to them? I mean, it's very simple. One of them is speak to migrants. If you're reporting about women's rights or disability rights, you wouldn't have the story. You don't have a group of men talking about the rights of women. You would have women talking about the rights and maybe a man supporting that. And you should treat migrants the same, and you should address them as people and not as, the migrants drowning. Those are people, a human being, their families, their children. There's no such thing as a refugee child. A child is a child, A refugee is an experience, is a temporary experience.
So I think media can do much more to make sure that migrants are speaking in stories about them. I mean, there recently been so many research, including us, Migrant Voice, last summer during the election campaign. We did this analysis of media coverage of 8 outlets, including some of the main ones in the UK. And we still discovered that we're largely absent. Migrants are absent from the media coverage. So I think there are great journalists like Tan and others who come to us and say, you know, do you want to talk? What do you have something to say? So I think the media should actually make sure that migrants are, you know, at the center of the stories about them.
I'm going to come to you, Diane, because we have heard a number of people highlight your work, the kind of work that you're pushing on, I mean, the kind of work that we're trying to do in the media. I mean, we've covered Sudan at Sky News for the last, you know, several years, actually, and tried to push that story, humanize the Sudanese people and their journey. But somewhere along the line, that narrative starts to change.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with what all the other speakers have said. As someone who mainly focuses on news, I would say the biggest problems and the biggest challenges are that news has become much, much faster. So every minute there's breaking news. So, you know, for our news desk, something's a story, and then bang, 2 minutes later, something else has happened. That takes precedence. Bang, 3 minutes later, something else has exploded. And it's very hard to keep context in the eyes of readers or viewers or listeners, whatever, when there's just this kind of, I sometimes think of the vomit emoji when when I look at news websites, because it's just kind of pouring. And I think as well as the lack of broader context, you know, in terms of migration, how many people actually do move, how many come to the UK, how much tax they pay, how many people have been tortured, all those kinds of things that would be useful context for the public. We don't really hear them. And in terms of human stories, they are there, but I think there are 2 problems with the human stories. Often they're siloed. So I might get asked, oh, could you get a case study demonstrating A or B? And then quite often the case study is anonymous and it's a kind of set aside in a separate panel. So it's not really linked to the main predominant media narrative about migration. And the second issue with the humanization is that, for very understandable reasons, many migrants don't want to tell their stories and don't want to be identified or can't be identified or can't tell their stories. And as I say, there are very understandable reasons for that. But I think that kind of deficit in information also contributes to the dehumanization. You know, I was talking to someone just now about when you're sitting face to face with a refugee and you hear what they say, everything falls into place. As well, it's obvious why that person would get onto a small boat. You know, they've been through hell. But I think we're not communicating that well enough in the media, and we're not joining up the dots between the policy and the humans.
Diana, you talk there about kind of this sugar hit that we give our audiences with this kind of vomit of information daily. And we're seeing that actually played out with the, you know, reality TV show that is Donald Trump. I mean, we seem to cut all broadcasting and everything else as soon as he talks, and it takes away from, you know, in-depth journalism that we do on other issues. And we you know, we're trying, where I did an interview with the foreign minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We didn't drop that because Trump was suddenly speaking, because these issues are important to sort of cover. But do you think that's a sort of an error that we're making, assuming that that's what the audience wants, that they constantly want this kind of stream of breaking news rather than in-depth, thoughtful analysis about issues around migrants, refugees, where they've come from and the issues that they're facing?
Yeah, I do think we might be making a mistake on that. I mean, on on our website, the human stories always get very well read. I mean, obviously it depends what, not just about migration, but just humans are interested in humans. So it depends what the story is. But I do feel the media, and this is a global point, focuses disproportionately on what is spilling out of politicians' mouths. And I think we all collectively forget that we're actually not reporting on 99% of what is going on in the world, because we're so busy reporting what politicians say. And like the rest of us, politicians are quite flawed, but we pay a lot of attention to their thoughts and policies, etc.
Vivian, I'm going to come to you. You've got a thing, you're a founder of a thing called the Refugee Journalism Project. Could you just tell us a little bit about it and how you're trying to change attitudes through it?
So essentially, it was born out of a lot of the things that our panelists have already mentioned, this idea of narrative change and who holds the power, how you get better representation. And essentially, it extends from Migrant Voice in that I was meeting a lot of exiled journalists, essentially, who wanted to contribute to the narrative change, but ultimately they didn't want to do it in a way where they were interviewed for a short clip. I had one lady who said to me, a broadcaster came to interview her, stayed with her for about an hour, and it ended up being reduced down to a 20-second clip. And there were lots of stories like that where people felt their experiences were just being taken and used. So we founded a project whereby we invited journalists who had been displaced to try to reintegrate them with their careers. So it involved workshops, it involved mentoring, it involved paid placements, because I think that's the other key, is that yes, it's okay to be interviewed, but ultimately these are professional people who want to be able to work and contribute in a very impactful way. And so where it works well, we've got graduates who are now working at Bloomberg, the BBC, they've worked at Thomson Reuters. And so that's essentially what the project delivers.
And what have you found just doing that, placing people in these key places where they are part of the conversation at the table and are also listening to, I guess, the conversations that are being had in newsrooms and elsewhere?
Absolutely. I think it's key that they're able to input into the editorial conversations. And so they're able to, I don't want to stereotype and assume that every exiled journalist wants to report on migration, because I think that's wrong, but they are there, they are visible, and they are able to contribute to the editorial discussions. And so when a journalist might have a question, when they might want to access a particular community, there are people around the table who can support that. But it's interesting, when I do think, like many of the other panelists, that there has been a shift. I remember when we first entertained the idea of placing journalists within media organisations, I had questions about, well, can they be objective? Which was quite interesting. But I think things have moved on since then. I think it's more, some of the coverage is more nuanced, but also I think there's more inclusivity within the newsrooms.
And can I just ask, I mean, placing those journalists there and them being able to offer, a better understanding, have they found that has helped shift and change the kind of storytelling that may have taken place?
I think it's differently. We haven't really, we haven't comprehensively looked at it in terms of a research project, but I think, anecdotally, yes, we have feedback, really good feedback in terms of the contribution that they've been able to make, but also they've been able to kind of get on with their lives. And we did a toolkit, we prepared a toolkit for media organisations who want to hire exiled journalists, because there are a lot of questions around the legality, the well-being, mental health issues. And so we prepared a toolkit based on the reflections of the journalists, but also media organisations who we've been working with over a number of years. And overwhelmingly, they talked about the positives, the enhancement to their editorial decisions, and the team in terms of regional knowledge, in terms of accessing, as I said, communities.
Emma, I mentioned briefly, go back to where you came from. It's something that I understand quite well, actually, because it did divide the public in Australia, and actually politicians capitalized on it, but it also just opened up a whole debate because of the refugee migrant crisis that Australia was facing at the time about what to do about the issues. Can you tell us just a little bit about the show, but also what the journey of the people who went through it and what they found?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, that was 12 years ago as well in Australia. So it's taken quite a long time for this series to be made here in the UK, and Channel 4 has been on their radar for a long time. And they actually, the two commissioners are Australian, and they were big fans of the series when it went out in Australia. So, and obviously it was called Go Back to Where You Came From There, hence the, the inheritance of the title, and also having to come up with something that would stand out in, like you were saying, this so much content out there now. There's Netflix, there's Apple, it's just viewers are just inundated with things to watch, and you have to do something that will grab attention, unfortunately, but that's just the way it is to bring the type of people we wanted to watch this program to this subject. So essentially we take people who have got views on immigration, both pro and anti, and we take them on sections of the refugee journey. We introduce them to people who are in, we took one group to Syria, we took one group to Somalia, and then we followed their journey through select countries, because obviously, again, we were under, that's a whole other conversation about the constraints we were under when we were trying to make this series, because obviously we're not, we're not used to working in war zones. We're not used to working in current affairs. We have Nada here in the back. She is very much used to working in that environment. We work very closely with people who work in current affairs, and we took them on this journey. We took them out of their living rooms, and we took them to the heart of the issue and introduced them to people along the way who could share their stories about what it's like to be displaced, and also what it's like to be on that journey themselves. So again, what you were saying about trying to humanize the people behind these headlines, behind the statistics. And Matilda is here. She was on the series. She's our very, very much pro immigration, is also a journalist, and really brought some very, very good arguments to the table with our people who are anti-immigration. But I think you probably admit as well that it's very difficult to reach a lot of people by just spouting statistics at them and the history and our role in why these countries are displaced, when to them they're just looking at something that they are feeling from their heart. So what we were trying to do was to put, like you were saying, put them in front of people so they couldn't escape the stories, they couldn't escape what they were seeing in these people's eyes, and let them then decide off the back of that how that impacts how they feel about immigration in the UK. Everybody goes on a journey. The whole series is now up on the Channel 4 platform, and we have Dave, who was a product of his environment. He lives in a predominantly white area. He goes down the social club, listens to the right-wing GB News rhetoric daily, hourly, was saying it on his own platform to people who also were feeding into the narrative. So he, obviously, if you've seen the series, you'll see in Syria, he was heartbroken, traumatized by what he saw, and continued to go on this journey of change. And since he's come back, he has held those views. And actually what's really fascinating is that he's really struggling now to reintegrate himself into his environment, because he's surrounded by people who are essentially saying what he was saying before he went out, and he is trying to figure out how he tells people about his experience and how he helps affect change, but with the people he knows, that how he was feeling before he went out. He's like, I don't want to be preached at. I don't want to have this I don't want to be attacked for my views. So it's really interesting talking to him about how he helps get this information out about the experience that he's had, because he has changed so much. And it really has affected him deeply. The same with our contributor Jess, who obviously Matilda was on the journey with. She again does a complete turn on the views that she had mainly through someone she met in a camp in Dadaab, a mother and former anesthesiologist in Mogadishu. Again, she was like, what? Like, people who live in refugee camps had a job like that. It's just all these things, little things that we could help people understand that they were just human beings who all had hopes and dreams and had the same, they have families just like we have families, they have hopes, they want the best for themselves. And, that really affected her, and that helped her, it didn't immediately change her thoughts, because she still thought, well, Dadaab is the same size as Cardiff. What do? We can't have everyone come to the UK. But it started to help her question, at least, the things that she very much was being fed information through TikTok, through YouTube. She wasn't watching the news. She was getting fed this information, and whether we like it or not, that is what's happening out there. And these things that we hear in the series are really uncomfortable to hear from the voices of British citizens. But up and down the country, these are things we heard time and time again, and it is awful. But if we ignore them and we don't do something like this, where you have to confront it, then it's just going to stay in its little echo chamber. It's going to metastasize, and it just becomes poisonous. So what we were trying to do was to, in some way, shape or form, address that rhetoric and try and break it down, really. And it worked, but it's whether people can watch it on TV and go on this journey with them. So we've had responses from people who follow Dave on his platform and have the same views, and they've come back and saying he's had so much feedback. He's got 500,000 viewers on TikTok, and they're all saying, oh my God, Lampedusa, where's that? Like, I had no idea that existed, and all these people were going through this, and oh wow, like, how eye-opening, and it's making me question my beliefs, and that, I think, is really important. And whether it's people agree with the sort of the method that we chose, there is proof that it's a way to reach a certain demographic of people who might not connect.
That's really fascinating. I actually want to get your views on that, Nazik, and what you're hearing through characters who are part of this series, but I guess these are just certain characters. We're sort of talking collectively about attitudes as a whole.
Yes. So I mean, thank you. I haven't watched that program, just to admit, but I mean, hearing you, I'm just feeling uncomfortable, because for me I don't need to entertain people or to make them cry to think I am not an ordinary human being. Just because you fled the war, it doesn't make a different species. I think my, concern about this is we see people as though they're not like us, they're different, they're not human beings. I mean, I don't know, there is something here that makes people, we're superior to you, and you, just because there's a war you came, oh, you have families, or you have jobs. I mean, it really makes me uncomfortable. I mean, I'm sorry, I mean, I'm sure it's a successful program. I would never think about it, because I feel, what, I want to see me as a person. We're all equal. And also migration is not one way road, yeah? Migration, 10% of British people travel abroad. When we talk about migration, it's all about all those vulnerable people, all those poor them. Oh, look at them. Oh my God, this makes us so uncomfortable. You also travel, but you don't mention it. There is no mention in a conversation, in debate, that migration is two-way road, and people travel, from Europe, from US, from all over the world. You don't even think about it. You travel, you go work, holiday, you do what you want. It's not a problem. It's like you're entitled. But when someone comes to you, even they recruit them to come and work for you here, then, there are problems, they're different. Oh, why they're here? And we talk about them like something strange. And doesn't happen. I mean, sorry about this. I'm sure there are people support, but I feel uncomfortable because the conversation is treating people as really vulnerable and not as a human being. And societies are the same. People, in Nigeria or in Lebanon or in, Sweden, they all have institutions, they have professions, they have families, they have lives. But, the reason people move sometimes because there is a war, and we shouldn't reduce them to those vulnerable people who become, look, we have to feel sorry for them. We need to understand, because look, those people, then we become almost a different people, different human beings.
Yeah, and I just want to sort of just ask you a little bit more about that, Nazik, because this program was controversial in Australia as well, because the people were divided about how they viewed, this journey that people were on. But how, I mean, given that you work really hard to place the stories of refugees, migrants, and the different journeys that people have, how then do you think is the best practice to deal with this? Because we do sort of think about different ways to humanize, to as you say, you felt uncomfortable hearing about that they have jobs and they have hopes and dreams, but we do try and do that through our journalism as well, outside of series, so that people can understand.
I mean, well, going back to some of the challenges we face to do that. I mean, maybe if I mention a couple of examples from some of the stories to tell you, this is stereotype, this, different perception who we are as people. And I'm going to link it to all media rather than the public. So one example, we had a request when the restrictions were lifted. This is an old example, but it explains what we're facing. When the restrictions against Bulgarians and Romanians were lifted and they were allowed to come to the UK. I mean, then the media went, crazy, lots of stories, and we have requests from, respectable, reputable media. I don't want to name them, but when the top media asking me, do you have any Romanians and Bulgarians happy to speak? I said, yes, of course I do. Yes, we have members. They're happy to speak. Yes, can you tell me about them? Yes, I have a housing officer, I have an academic and a dentist. Oh, do you have any? Oh, they're lovely. But do you have any people who do normal jobs? And I said, what do you mean normal jobs? I thought those were normal jobs. No, I meant, do you know anyone who's a care worker or a cleaner? And I said, no, I don't have, sorry, I can't help you. This is one example. Another example where another city in UK, this publication, regional publication, that we're so pro-migrants, all our stories are positive. And when we looked at their stories and analyzed them, they're all about, and this is a Scottish, I'm not going to say the name of that publication, because they're very good friends of us. Oh, this amazing, lovely granny who knit all these jumpers for those poor children called Children in Calais. Oh, this wonderful, Scottish teenager, graduation teenager who, all his pocket money is France. He went to a van and went to whatever to help those poor people. And I said, all the stories about how poor we are, how vulnerable, how we just need to someone to look after us, to feed us out, like have no agency. And a final example, another region, West Midland, we also analyzed the one media before we went and spoke to their editors, and all the stories about migrants are connected to crimes. They're either, the victim of crimes or they committed crimes. And we said to them, look, all your stories, if you link us to crimes, people think we're criminals. So, these are the issues, the challenges we face. The stories are told because there is certain stereotype out there, and, the stories start to be formed around them. And they don't look at us as just people, I moved from one place to another and I'm here. I'm just a person. Look at me as a person, as equal, and talk to me as people talk to us, not as a different, species. Or I think the problem is this big stereotype, and it's not helped by, the governments again presenting us all the time as a problem and try to compete who's tougher to gain some of the votes. And the story is a story because we write about it. In the past, people moved, and this was not big story in the media. It's only when you decide to turn it into story and you think, oh, we can sensationalize it and people can read it, can buy it, then it becomes a story. I think the story needs to change, and you need to start talk about migrants as normal people, just ordinary people. Talk about migration as it is, what it does, who those people are, away from stereotypes. And
Andrew, I'm going to bring you in because one of the points that Nazik raised there was, government policies, and you've investigated the policies that governments have put together and the impact they then have on people on the ground. Just talk about how those policies have impacted people and how then journalists can shed light to change perceptions on the impact it's having on them.
I'll give you two examples, relatively recent ones. The Today program anchored co-anchored, I should say, a whole show from Bulgaria. It was part of Nick Robinson's occasional forays into examining migration in Europe. And and fine, but actually, if you know anything about that particular border, Bulgaria and Turkey, you will know that there have been countless, well documented, like plenty of testimony about quite egregious human rights abuses against migrants by the Bulgarian police. And we didn't hear much about that at all. And not only that, but actually Nick Robinson sort of broadcast the show from the office of the head of the Bulgarian police, Bulgarian border police. I think that's a striking ethical decision, personally.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's a time factor, a budget factor, just a perception, a stereotype? What are the reasons behind covering that story that way?
The story centered quite a lot on what the Bulgarian police are doing to sort of control their border. So there was a lot of, I think they didn't interview the dog, but they showed a dog who's sniffing for various sort of contraband and whatnot. And there was a lot of sort of border theatre. I'm not saying it's not something worthy of coverage. And there was an interview. They tried to get into actually a very notorious sort of horrific slum-like camp that the Bulgarians run there, and were not given access. And they did say so, and they tried. But again, like, would you do a story about like police abuse in London and broadcast the show from the police station? Probably not. The other example, for like Keir Starmer goes to Italy, meets with his counterpart, Giorgia Meloni, and, about how to, work together on migration. Italy, for a while, has been the central player in cooperating with militia, basically, in Libya, who capture migrants at sea, take them back to dungeons, torture them, sexually abuse them, extort them for money, often are involved in the smuggling themselves. And sort of, for me, that kind of ruins everything about what Italy may or may not do with migration and sort of, and also Tunisia, by the way. David Lammy recently, I think, invited the dictator of Tunisia to give a speech at Oxford. This stuff kind of matters because, like, that's, if you want to partner on with European countries on migration, that's what that means, And but do you hear that when Starmer goes to meet Meloni? Do you hear testimonies? There are many of them around, people who've been trapped in these nightmarish scenarios in Libya, in dungeons paid for by the Italian taxpayer. No, and again, I think I'm very gloomy and I'm not very fun to be at dinner parties with, but I do go back to the point of, like, this leads to mass atrocities and it happens under our watch. Sometimes we pay for it. And not nice to hear, but it happens and should be raised more in all conversations about sort of, keeping the numbers down and combating, smugglers and so on.
Dan, I think one of the challenges, and we've touched on it a little bit, but is this idea of not just stereotypes, but misinformation that's now out there. And as mainstream media and as journalists, we're constantly dealing with the sorts of things that Emma raised as well. People get their information from TikTok, they get their information from social media platforms, not necessarily from people who are experts in the field or understand, the issue, but are just kind of telling people things that may or may not be true. So these are the challenges we as journalists are also facing, on top of all the sort of issues around stereotypes and dehumanizing people when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, I don't think any individual media outlet can persuade, someone who holds far-right views to read The Guardian every day and start adopting those very different kinds of views. I think the issue goes much deeper than the media and is at a government policy level. And I think increasingly, in terms of where migrants live and how they're treated, they're being siloed from the rest of society. And so it's much harder for an average British person to be sitting alongside a migrant in their daily life, and talking to them and seeing them as just another human being. So I think in a way, what media people choose to consume is an extension of that. You know, for example, putting asylum seekers in hotels with security guards. How is an ordinary person ever going to speak to them? Putting them in condemned houses in Middlesbrough where no one else is living. They're not going to be part of communities. I remember doing a story when Labour was in power previously, and they're also very tough on migration, but people were not quite as siloed as now. And there was a Kurdish girl in a school in quite a white BNP area, a very popular girl at school, very friendly with a lot of the white kids. And it was when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and her family were threatened with forced removal. She was from Syria. It was before all the Syrian conflict started in more than a decade ago. And she and her sister and mother were placed in detention. And the school did a protest about the deportation. And some of the kids had BNP parents, and they joined the protest. And they said, I'm going to tell Tony Blair that, you know, he can't deport this family, that they're our friends. And I think that only happened because those kids who were getting the BNP messages at home saw something different at school. And I talked to the head teacher, and he said that he had to organise counselling for some of the kids from the BNP families because they were so confused, a bit like you were saying, that they were so confused about the sort of messages at home and then what they were seeing. But again, seeing the human was what made the difference, rather than a change in media coverage, because you can always find whatever you want to find in the media, and you know, AI and Trump and dictatorship hasn't got to the point where we're not allowed to read the media we want to read or watch or whatever. But I think, like your program, that sometimes confronting people with things they might not otherwise see or experience is really the game changer, not necessarily just in the context of a TV program, but in the context of life. And I think that lack of integration has allowed a lot of racist, xenophobic attitudes to flourish. And I think that's what we really need to be addressing. And the media is a symptom of some of those segregation policies.
And which, before I open up the floor to the audience, Jessica, I want to come to you, because that's really the findings of what you've been looking into, that there is hope, you know, that there is this disconnect between how the media are necessarily, you know, portraying things and actually the kind of findings that you guys are finding when it sort of comes to attitudes.
Yeah. I think, so just taking that one step further and thinking about what the media can still do better. I think one thing we're also seeing is that language is sometimes used quite carelessly or in inaccurate ways in terms of the terminology that's used, talking about people as illegal migrants. People aren't illegal, they're human beings, as the panel already talked about. But also it's about their journeys, and that maybe breaking some rules or regulations, but not the people themselves. And there are very few people who actually do make those irregular journeys. The vast majority come legally, even those who end up with an irregular status later. The vast majority enter the country legally with a visa in their pocket and then maybe overstay. And the actual migration that's happening, the legal migration, the 90% of migration that is actually legal and where people come in to fill vacancies, to keep our economy going. That is just not being talked about, and it's not being talked about by politicians either. So the media is also kind of propping up that political disconnect between what they're saying and their kind of toxic messages they're giving to the media and what they're actually doing under the table, and the policies they're putting in that do bring more people to the country because they're needed. So I think that's what the media really needs to do, to kind of break down that disconnect and to show the realities of migrants, as we talked about, but also the realities of migration and why it's happening and the labor demand that there is.
Yes.
Can I make a quick comment? Just also, I think what's missing also from the media, that people crossing by boat the channel, this is not illegal under international law. There is nothing under international law that says, tell you how to travel if you're fleeing for your life. If you flee war persecution, these are the legal ways you can take. And if you travel by boat is illegal. There's nothing, it's not against international, it's not illegal. And I think the media is, just playing with politicians, responding to them and giving them this microphone.
Yeah.
And people need to understand, no, it's not illegal. People, if you're fleeing for your life, there's no legal way for you. I mean, especially the UK and Europe, most of Europe at this now, they made it very impossible for you to come through safe routes. They close, all these routes are non-existent, almost non-existent. So if you're fleeing for your life, just get out of that, doesn't matter which way you come out, it's not illegal. And we use the word illegal is the most, troublesome word for us to face, because no, it's not illegal. You just get out. If you're afraid for your life, you claim asylum, there's no legal or illegal route. So, and I think this is really important, because we started about, people were here illegally. No, they're not here illegally. Actually, they exercise their rights under international law. And I think it's really important that it doesn't come across in the media.
I think just to say quickly, if
Sure,
that's
of course,
okay,
no.
on that point, I agree with you. And there are protections under international law, the Geneva Convention, but unfortunately, legislation was passed by the last government to make it illegal to arrive. So it's difficult in the media in terms of how we report it, because that's what's on the statute book, and parts of the Illegal Migration Act have been repealed by this government, but not all of it. So there are still many prosecutions. The last time I saw some Freedom of Information data on it, there have been hundreds of prosecutions of small boat people for arriving here illegally just because they traveled on a small boat. I'm not backing or supporting that in any way, but that's unfortunately what,
Want to say something on that? Because working as a journalist, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Working as a journalist before the illegal migration bill and after the illegal migration bill, this frustration has continued. Under international law, it is not illegal. It never has. It still is not illegal to enter a country without a visa to claim asylum. Before the illegal migration bill, the vast majority of our media was still describing people doing that as illegal migrants. I raised it with my editor at the time. I refused to use the term. I explained that actually factually it's inaccurate. There is no legislative basis even within the UK at that point in time to describe this person as illegal. And the editor said to me, this is a mainstream UK paper, that we have to use the language that people understand, and this is the language that people understand. So I guess my question there is, where is leadership? Where is the line between leadership and followship for a media that has to communicate with its public, but is also tasked with the duty of educating them?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just follow up on that? So I would say that it's, broadly speaking, everyone on the panel agrees with each other, and I'd say everyone in the room probably agrees with everyone on the panel. But did you invite anyone from the right-wing press? Like, they, there are editorial and political incentives to be cruel in the media. But to understand that, it's no good us having a conversation amongst ourselves. We all agree. We all agree that there needs to be a much more humanizing, normalized story of migration. We agree that using language around illegality is problematic, dehumanizing. We agree that the media is absolutely not getting it right. But we need to listen to the right-wing media and understand, what are your political, financial, editorial, professional incentives for being so cruel? And I think there is responsibility for organisations looking to challenge this stuff to talk to them, get them in the room, hear from them. Why do you constantly use the term illegality? Why do you dehumanise people? Without that, we're just talking to ourselves and we don't penetrate outside this bubble. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's, and Tegan, we can, perhaps bring this to you, because I think one of the issues that I guess a lot of people face is we are now in echo chambers where people are talking to themselves, and not necessarily wanting to hear uncomfortable views from outside. And I think that's really quite important. But you sort of wanted to raise some issues as well.
Yes. So hi, I'm Director of Communications here at ODI Global. So we're a think tank, and I think that there are other communications professionals in the room from think tanks, but also from NGOs and civil society organizations. So I'd love to hear from the panel, what material do you need from us? What sorts of stories or evidence would help you, particularly those of you working in the media and working in organizations that are trying to champion migrants' voices? How can we help you to bridge that gap that Diane was describing between the human interest story and the policy?
I mean, I cover foreign news at Sky News, and we try and get to the places where things are happening. So we talked there about, this week alone, Sky was in the DRC. We cover stories in Sudan. I've for years been going in and out of places like Turkey. I've been in Lampedusa. I was covering the so-called migrant crisis. But I think part of the issue is the sugar rush that we were talking about. We cover the stories in that moment and try and, help people understand what's going on and attempt to humanize as much as we can, and try and make the stories as individual as we possibly can, because people relate to individuals. I remember covering the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq, and we were looking at internally displaced people in Dohuk, and everyone kept talking about 15,000 people had been displaced. And I guess for us, finding key individual stories so that people aren't thinking, oh my God, this is like, who are these people? These are people, as you were saying, who have homes, who don't want to leave. Actually, we found that actually a lot of these people don't want to leave their homes. They're forced to go. And as we've seen from the Syrians, the first thing they want to do is go back. That they don't necessarily want to leave their homes or be displaced in camps. So, I mean, for me, it's sort of getting access more to those individual voices. But Andrew, I don't know if you...
I mean, it might sound like a facetious answer or a useless answer to your question, but also, have you considered reaching out to people not in say journalism, but rather, makers of programs? Like, imagine if you had an asylum seeker character in Bake Off or EastEnders or Traitors or something like that, something that has a generally massive audience, not like the increasingly shrinking ones that media outlets do. It's an idea,
I guess, and then those characters become caricatures of themselves in those series,
Well, hopefully not, but I mean, for example, you sometimes, whenever there is a horrific punitive policy against asylum seekers, used to be under the Conservatives, continues under Labour, you sometimes hear, but hang on, this would mean that Mo Farah wouldn't be allowed here. And you heard it the other day when Labour seems to be now segregating refugees and denying them ever citizenship. I saw quite a few comments around that said, "How that would mean that Sir Mo Farah won't be a citizen." Like, you need to reach out to these sort of public figures that have mass appeal. Not just very self-selecting, rowdy, unrepresentative, violent anti-immigration voices. Most people don't want migrants to be blown up by landmines in the English Channel, and to sort of imply that is the anti-immigration view that needs. I mean, of course, it exists and it should be battled, but it's not representative of anti-migration view. Most Brits tend to want fairness and order and queue.
Yeah, sorry, go, I'll just, allow you.
Sorry,
Yes.
just to respond to a couple of points. Firstly, the lady who mentioned about we have to go to these different environments, these very uncomfortable environments. One of the things we did was to take a group of exiled journalists to a tabloid newspaper, right-wing tabloid newspaper, to meet the managing editor, to have that conversation, because I think you're right, we need to go to the heart of the story and find out why and what we need to do differently. Secondly, I think education is key, and it goes back to your point about where are the spaces where we can have these conversations. And again, one of the things that I do is I'm an academic, so I bring exiled journalists into the classroom to work with the students, so they actually, most of them haven't come into contact with refugees. Certainly not refugee journalists. So the idea that they can work together, they can work on exercises, they can work on collaborative projects, it builds that understanding.
Vivian, just on that point with taking, the group of journalists as part of your project, what was the interaction finding? What did both sides learn from that experience?
I think it was just about, for the journalists, the exiled journalists themselves, it was just a point at which they could channel their questions and frustrations and feel respected, that someone quite senior was listening to them. How that fed through into action, a paid placement was organised. So there were sort of small positive outcomes, but I think overall it was about, okay, we respect you, we want to validate what you have said. It was very uncomfortable, but I think it's important.
We've got plenty of questions in the room. I'll start with this side and then I'll move to that side, just in the back.
Thank you for that. It was a really, really good conversation. I guess my question is, being a Black Muslim woman, I just recall that when the Ukraine and Russia war broke out, it was quite easy for the media to be very positive and to frame it as our neighbors, people like us, or this could be us. So what is the challenge? Is it because it's brown people, or is it because, we don't look like the majority of British people here? I mean, I'm not quite sure where the disconnect is, because we're having a whole conversation about, is the media getting it right? But they were able to get something right when there was mass displacement with the Ukraine war. So what's the challenge, do you think, in reporting these stories as positive for Black and brown people who are coming here, who may be fleeing war?
Thank you. And I'll just take a question just next to you as well, and then I'll bring it back to the panel.
Thank you. I'm here from the Migrant Rights Network. We've been working on a lot of the issues that have been discussed today, particularly actually the issue that the person asking the question before me said about the disconnect between how we talk about people of colour, racialised people from the Global South. Firstly, Nazik, I just really wanted to say what you were saying really resonated about how whenever we get approached by journalists, they kind of want to look for a very narrow story of who migrants, including refugees, are. And it's often what you were saying, like the vulnerable migrant, the deserving migrant. It's very rarely actually what the vast amount of people we work with experience, or the diversity of experiences of the people in our network, who they are. So I just wanted to say, thank you for raising that point. Sorry, another point, some of the language, I know we talked a lot about illegal, that is a point that has been argued against for a really long time. Even the UN says itself, do not use the term illegal. We can use other words like criminalized to highlight how people are made into these collective nouns that we put on people. And also mass migration as well is something that we've been pushing against for a long time, because it places the blame on people moving rather than looking at how it is the failures of policy that put people into those situations. I'm not sure that we probably do all agree with how the media is framing things. I think and I know some other colleagues here, have been banging our heads against the wall for a really long time about how migrants are framed in the media. there is a real resistance in even so-called pro-migration narratives about how racism, ableism, Islamophobia, classism shape a lot of the quite pro-migration narratives in the media. Things like contribution, legitimate concerns, hardworking, paying tax, all things that disability justice, queer liberation, racial justice movements have been pushing for us to not say, and we continuously reinforce in the migration sector on a daily basis. And so what I would like to kind of understand, and this is a question for everyone, and I think links to the previous question, is how can we as people working for a better narrative on migration ensure that we are looking at it in an intersectional way, in an anti-oppression way, and listen to the work of other social justice movements?
Great, thank you. I'm just going to put both those two questions to the panel. Emma, I might come to you in terms of the disconnect that, you know, a lot of people have raised as an issue in terms of when we saw Ukrainian refugees and displaced people leaving Ukraine versus attitudes towards Syrians. And I just wonder, through the program that you did and through some of the attitudes you were hearing, was there that disconnect that people were feeling as well, you know, versus the responsibility of the media?
Yeah, no, definitely. In fact, it's a conversation that's actually had in the series between two of the contributors. It's like, well, why were we okay with the Ukrainian refugees, but why are we not okay with refugees from anywhere else? And it, you know, definitely was talked about whether it was color or culture. And I definitely, again, it's quite often born out of fear and not being educated. And that is definitely what we saw with certainly when we were in the casting process, we were talking to people up and down the country, is there was well, my culture is going to change, the British culture is going to change, and they're different to me. And there was, well, the Ukrainians, they're like kind of westernized, right? So that definitely fed into why people are feeling the way that they feel about maybe people of color, is that they think that because they're not educated maybe on it, that they think, well, you know, this is going to affect my culture here in the UK. So that was the voices that we were hearing for sure.
Anyone else on the panel? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for the Ukraine, because as I said earlier, you know, the narrative starts from top, because the politician projected immediately positive message about Ukrainians. So the media followed suit, the public followed suit, and you know, this is the cycle start from the top. If the government was negative about Ukrainians, then you would have seen them, you know, reported on, and you've seen they would face similar issues like others. I'm just going to bring a memory many years ago, before again, I've lived here long enough. I've heard lots of conversation on the ground from people talking about joining Europe, and people were the discussion, oh, just because they look like us, they're not like us, we have to be careful. They were talking about Europeans. So, I mean, you know, it's how the message from politicians comes on the public, influence how people react. But earlier I was talking about what can the media do. I mean, it's really important for those of us who are trying to get stories out in the media. We are made to, well, I mean, you understand that journalists these days are under lots of pressures. They're not like in the past. I mean, my husband is a journalist in another country. He used to have someone to type, someone to take photos, someone to design. Now the journalists have to do everything and quickly and fast, because the story would move and you have to go on the next story. So we're ended up doing a lot of the work needed to pitch the story. And sometimes we've been asked too much of us. I mean, I'm just give one example, one story. When the asylum seekers in hotel story broke out, it was big, and we started having people who are in hotels coming to us to say, but this is my situation, there are 8 of us in the room, and there is, you know, 1 toilet on the whole floor and 1 shower on 2, and you know, we're developing diabetes. So they came to tell us a story. When we told the journalists, some of the judges, you know, report that story, and we had some photos and short videos. So they asked us to take more videos. Now we couldn't get them those videos because it was not safe for the asylum seekers, because it was all over the media, and everyone is worried and terrified they've been attacked or kicked out even of this hotel. And the journalists decided not to run with the story because we could not get them long enough videos. So we actually now expected to come up with the right angle, why the story is important. We have to do a lot of the work now for journalists, and sometimes it is harder for us. Just one challenge to throw out there.
Andrew, did you want?
Very quick thing on Ukraine. I mean, I interviewed like a few days after the war, non-white refugees coming out of Ukraine who actually said living in Ukraine, they'd never actually really experienced much racism, but then trying to get out, trying to flee with everyone else, they had guns pointed at them, they were put into different queues to get on the train and so on. So that was real. It wasn't a story that got picked up too much. And I think with Ukraine, you had the racism thing for sure, but also you had an enemy that say UK media consumers understand, which is Putin. You know, he's killing Ukrainians, but he also wants to kill us all, wants to nuke us all, sets chemical weapons off in the streets of Salisbury. You know, do most people in the UK know about the warring factions in Sudan, or the president of Eritrea, or the Iranian regime, and so on? So I connect it to the kind of international coverage that affects the domestic understanding of where people are coming from. And then second thing is, there was a scheme for Ukrainians. They didn't have to get into boats. They took planes, you know, and it's that kind of order and control and kind of predictability that allows you to actually not have choreographed chaos. That's probably also why it was popular. They were welcomed.
Yeah, and that reinforces that image then of the kind of good refugees, right? The fact that they didn't get on those boats.
Yeah.
I'll just come to this side of the room and then I'll just a couple in the back and then I'll move forward.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Anna. I'm also from the Migrants' Rights Network. I just had a general question around just kind of what I've been seeing with the media is actually quite frustrating, because the word like racism is rarely, if ever, mentioned. And I feel like, aside from one panelist who explicitly mentioned the word racism, I don't feel like that's ever really talked about. So like, in terms of the media getting it right on migration, like just call the anti-migrant sentiment what it is. Like, it's racism. And I don't understand why there's such a like resistance to saying what it is. And someone earlier had made the point around like, we need to talk to people on the far right to understand them, to understand the financial incentives behind, you know, far right news outlets. But I feel like that's a waste of time, because we already know why they're doing what they're doing. They're doing it because they want to scapegoat people. They're doing it because they want a political distraction. So I feel like we have all the answers. We don't need to keep speaking to people on the far right. Like, we know why we're doing it. We know why they're doing what they're doing. And I also had a question around the Go Back to Where You Came From show. I mean, could it be argued potentially that, you know, the airing of far right views on your channel potentially is a promotion of like disinformation? And I say disinformation, not misinformation. Disinformation because that's intentional. And I guess, is there not like that implication when you're allowing people with inaccurate information to air their views? Because I don't think we can have like cultural like relativism about this. Like, there's an objective truth. Migrants deserve respect. So any other view it's not fact. It's just bias. It's just racism. So like, that's my question around that. And I also think refugee experiences aren't a spectator sport. They're not a social experiment. They're not something that people can just like try for fun, dip in and out of. So I think it was like, at least from our organization's understanding, like really hurtful for people with lived experience to see their experiences being made into a show. And it also feels very like, what's the word? Kind of like coddling of far-right racists to get them to come on the show and educating them when they should be doing the work themselves to unlearn their views. So I just wonder what kind of message it gives when like far-right views, racist views are being aired, and obviously like humane, compassionate views are being aired. Like, they're both being aired at the same time. And it just kind of seems like they're both valid points of view when actually one is fact and one is just like racism. So yeah, sorry, loads of questions.
No, don't worry. Thank you. I've written them down. So we might take a couple more at the back and then I'll bring it back to the panel. Yeah, and then we'll come to
Hi, thanks. My name is Katerina. I work here at ODI, and I have a question for the panel about the absence of perhaps more technical information about migration. So we have talked about human stories and we have talked about political rhetoric coming from politicians. But my sense as a researcher is that there's not enough focus and attention on technical information in the sense of the fact that people have to apply for visas if they want to move, and visas have a cost, and not everyone can apply for a visa, or visas are often denied, and that there are not often schemes like, for example, the one for Ukrainians that was just mentioned. So my question is, how do you think this would impact on the debate on migration, if at all? Thanks.
Thank you. And then actually, I'll come here, Vince, and then to you, and then to the panel. I'll come to the back in a moment. Actually, I think they're passing around the mic. So,
hello, Ben from Plan International UK here. Just start off, just quickly before my question, just say thank you to the panel. I thought it's an emotive subject, but that was a really, really fascinating talk. Could genuinely have heard you talk about it all day. So thank you for that. Just looking at that question on the boards, I'm a media and PR officer myself, and just to slightly flip the question on its head, we have a bit of a tendency in media teams say, I'll put out to you guys a really heartbreaking story, just to give an example, say from an 8-year-old girl in a refugee camp in Chad from Sudan who's lost their parents. And we think we've got an amazing story here, and then inevitable experience of a media officer, you get no response whatsoever. And instead of us going to our default of going, oh, the media doesn't care about it, maybe I just wanted to ask instead, what about that from our end are we doing wrong? There must be a difference between sometimes what we send to the media and what the media wants in terms of good migration case studies. So if any of you have any thoughts on just what that gap is, what are the deficiencies in what we're sending you, and how can we improve what we send you to get those human stories across? Thank you.
I might just bring the questions to the panel, and we have about 10-15 minutes left. So I'll try and get through as many questions as possible. Emma, the question around go back.
Yeah, I think, and I completely understand where you're coming from, but I think to expect someone with far right views to unlearn them on their own is, I don't know how that happens, especially when you've got GB News and you've got all these things in TikTok in their face. Like, the only thing we can do is do what we did and take them out of their environment and introduce them to people on the ground. And I know you've not seen the series, but I don't think that we're choosing vulnerable people. Obviously, when we went to Somalia and Syria, yes, there are people who are in vulnerable situations because of the environment that they're in. But as they went along, we met people who were nurses, they were doctors, they had their stories. Like, it wasn't just people who were, what people might stereotypically think of as a refugee or an asylum seeker. So, to break down harmful rhetoric, we can't ignore it. Like, that's the most dangerous thing, in my opinion, because you ignore it, and everyone stays in these echo chambers and they metastasize and they stay online. And it's really, really dangerous. So whether you agree or not with the way that we approached it, it's got people talking about it who would never engage in this subject. And we've had feedback, lots of feedback from people who have said, I didn't know this, and this has changed my opinion. People who are GB News listeners, and that to me is really powerful. And I know we all want people to watch and engage with amazing documentaries. I want everybody to watch Exodus. I want everybody to watch the amazing stuff that BBCI do. Of course we do, but we've got to be realistic about how people come to the media and what they expect from us. And if we have to engage them in this way, then so be it. I made a show called Banged Up about prisons last year, and we decided to open our own prison. It's like, we put people in who are ex-convicts, and we put people in who were changing. We had politicians, yes, we had some celebrities in there. They all had some connection to being, to the prison system in some way, shape or form, and they all had their views on it. But yeah, I mean, that's not a traditional way of engaging with the subject. But, watch God, there's been amazing documentaries made about prisons. We're not trying to recreate that. We're trying to think of a different way to engage people. And I think we should be doing more of it.
Great.
I just wanted to come to you, Jessica, in terms of there was a question about the technical information that is lacking out there. Do you think that there should be more information, easily more accessible information, online and on other platforms?
Yeah, I guess the reason why the technical information is missing is because it doesn't make that interesting a story. It's maybe a bit boring to give the details of a scheme, but I think it can be done in subtle and in small ways as well. So for example, the Ukraine scheme pointing out that there is this possibility of a legal pathway for Ukrainians. That's like a half sentence. And I think it is really important to be very accurate in the reporting in terms of the policies, but also the data. I mentioned that before, because I think data is often used in such misleading ways. So just to give one more example, boat arrivals are often talked about in terms of the absolute numbers, and then they sound really shocking, like 20,000 people or 45,000 people. It sounds like a lot. But when you look at them as a proportion of total immigration, they're actually tiny. So I think small differences like that in terms of accuracy and I guess being really considerate about what is the story you're telling, they can make a difference.
And there was a question about sort of getting the good migration case studies to the media, to journalists. What sort of is the best way to approach it? I don't know if Andrew or Diane, you wanted to.
I think, I mean, some of your frustrations, I have to say, are also some of mine, and probably a lot of other journalists, because we're not editors, and the editors are the gatekeepers of the stories. We ourselves, like you, are proposing stories every day to our editors, and many of them are rejected. I would say that if you compare a case study to a bit of that breaking news that's vomiting out, that will increase your chances. So a very compelling human story that isn't pegged to anything that's currently on the news agenda is less likely to get picked up. Whereas timing is such an important part of everything in the media. And if you present on a plate the perfect case study at the perfect moment when everyone's engaging with it, however momentarily, it's much more likely to be picked up. Things that are offered in what the media might consider to be some kind of vacuum would be less likely. So when NGOs say to me, how can I get my stuff in the media, I'd say when there's some breaking news, send through your reaction comment to the news desk within 15 minutes before the next NGO has done it. And because they just want to get that breaking news online or whatever immediately, they're more likely to just take the first reaction comment, even if it isn't the most exciting one, they'll take it because they need a reaction comment and they need it fast. So I think speed is very key, and looking at what's going on in the news in the last hour or whatever, and when you're pitching stuff.
We have about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to take 3 questions here and then put it to the panel. If you can keep your questions as brief as possible. I think there's a mic that's going around.
I have the mic.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Sarah. I'm the communications manager at Mercy Corps, which is an international NGO. And it seems we have like a lot of intersecting challenges. We've talked a lot about the social media, everyone getting their news from social media, fast pace, needing to make 90-second news clips. But there's also audience, we're finding audience facing huge empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue, and those, it's really like people really struggle to care about everything. They're forced into kind of frightening stories all the time. NGOs, I think communicators probably relate, but yeah, I would be really interested to hear kind of some positive examples of what has worked any formats, strategies, different campaigns that really have worked within this topic. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I'll just take one here, one at the back, and then, yeah.
Thank you very much. Maria Gandara, Sightsavers International. You mentioned at the beginning on the video that the majority of the British public are for immigration. They're not against it. You also mentioned that we need migration to keep the economy running. My question is, why do you think the politicians in power do not come out and say this, which would immediately change the narrative? What's stopping them?
Great, thank you. And there's one just at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Building on questions from Ben and from Mercy Corps as well. Just sort of thinking about the fact that, you know, migration is not a static thing. People move, they move again, especially when we look at Sudan, we look at the DRC, South Sudan. You know, at the moment, we're sort of seeing in South Sudan, people who took refuge in Sudan now returning to South Sudan. And there are many other stories about people returning cross borders, especially in that kind of context. So sort of thinking about what you were saying about what foreign news and international news can do to help build the right kind of like environment for good, like positive messages about migration to land well. What can be done to sort of do more to tell the stories of returnees, and what can be done to actually help the British public understand that actually most people are seeking refuge cross-border. So, for example, Uganda takes in more refugees than any other country in Africa. We don't hear that enough. We don't hear people saying that. We don't hear the stories about the refugees being receiving hospitality in neighboring countries. We just have this weird kind of media bias that says everyone's coming to the UK, which isn't true at all. So just wanted to sort of add that in. And on a positive note, some of those returnee stories, especially so earlier last year, actually, I covered a story with a Times journalist about returnees coming from Uganda across the border into South Sudan. It was a really hopeful story. It was a really fantastic story because it kind of really championed the pioneers, the people who were kind of going first and sort of building up the communities and building up a good environment for other returnees to return to. So I do think there are hopeful stories to be told.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Vince Cable, I'll just come to you because, of course, there was a question there about what politicians can do and what governments can do. But I think you've got something to say as well anyway. Can we have the mic just here? Yeah.
Well, I was actually going to say we're perhaps overestimating politics. I mean, the people who watch GB News, or for that matter, Newsnight, tend to be anoraks. What really matters is popular culture. I think a couple of panelists made this point. And you get a very different story. I mean, if you look at the leading soaps, you know, EastEnders, Coronation Street, the big crime dramas. There's the new Verdi series, which is built around a Brummie-Asian detective. Popular programs, Bake Off, you mentioned. It was won by a Muslim woman with a headscarf. Strictly was won a couple of years ago by a Sudanese refugee. He's now a wildlife photographer and won by the popular vote. So, and actually, I think the significance of this is that what's driving the extreme right and why it's so dangerous is their anger. And part of their anger is they feel that this, when they turn on the telly, this is not the world they used to belong to or want to belong to, which was white. And how to deal with that is extremely difficult. But I think to portray the media as some sort of deficient conveyor of modern Britain is utterly wrong. I mean, the popular culture is in a way ahead of where enlightened public opinion should be.
Thank you. We've got about a minute, so I don't know if any of our panelists want to. Yeah, Nazik.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, to end with a positive story, I mean, I've lived in UK for many years and my children both are married to British and have British grandchildren. And we all live happily and it's a success story. But for example, when the riots happened in the summer, both us, myself, my husband, and my children, we were concerned that, do we have to look over our shoulder? Someone might want to come and attack us. So there are two different society, because yes, of course, most of the British public, they support, they're not anti-migrants, and the communities are living together and prospering together. So there is this positive story, it is there, and it must be told. But why politicians use migrants? Because they scapegoat them for votes. I mean, some of those, even the Labour Party's new suggestions, I think, Reform Party has a lot to do with them, because people just want to show they're tougher to gain votes. I think this is how we feel, at least. But also there's a lot of information missing, not just most people actually cross border next countries, and the poorest countries in the world have the largest number of people fleeing wars and persecution, but also how people are treated here. I mean, asylum seekers only form a small percentage of the number of migrants in UK, but they get a huge amount of coverage. You think it's a big problem. What we also don't hear about migrants, that, most migrants are not allowed to access public support, public funds, and they have to pay all their bills and etc. On top of that, right now, every migrant have to pay £3,600 every 2.5 years just to work in UK. This is a visa. This is how much we charge migrant workers when they come to work here, on top of everything else. And they're not entitled to support. We don't hear that. And even when you only hear, oh, migrants here for our homes, the hotels cost and detention cost. Most of this money is coming from migrants, actually are subsidizing the rest. We don't hear those stories. And even if you look at all the statistics show that migrants bring more than they take. Okay, there are people who take and you support, but actually overall they contribute, the positive net contributors. You do not hear those stories, and there are so many others. We need to be telling more of those stories, and also we need to be telling all the positive stories. So I didn't want to end the day on a negative note. I'm happy I have a British family, and yes, there are so many similar successful stories.
Nazik, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could thank our panelists.